Hey everyone, welcome to Movie Marathons HQ, where we do movie marathons watching some of our favorite movies. This video is part of our Avengers Doomsday movie marathon. We watch one movie every week, preparing for the release of Avengers Doomsday in December 2026. Today, we are discussing Captain America: The First Avenger. This movie was released in 2011 and directed by Joe Johnston. It's the first movie chronologically in the MCU and the expanded MCU. It's also the first movie in my personal order for this movie marathon. Positives of Captain America: The First Avenger. The first one is casting. The casting team, led by Sarah Halley Finn, did a great job in casting this movie. Chris Evans as Steve Rogers' Captain America is exceptional. I was hesitant of him being our Captain America because previous to this he had portrayed Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four in 2 Fantastic Four movies. Those movies aren't very good. He's good in them as Johnny Storm, although his characterization is kind of all over the map. But Chris Evans does a good job as Johnny Storm. It just seemed like, why would we have him as a new superhero and a new Marvel superhero at that, especially in that day and age when there weren't that many superhero movies being made. But I think he does very well in the role, and I think he does better in the Captain America sequels and Avengers movies, but this is a really good foundation. There's also Haley Atwell as Agent Carter. She does a great job. She's very charming, very charismatic. We get introduced to Hugo Weaving as Red Skull. I think he's really creepy, really megalomaniacal, and does a great job as Red Skull. The design for Red Skull is also really creepy. Just super Nazi, painful looking skull thing, no nose. I just think he looks really good. Red Skull does appear later in the MCU in Infinity War as kind of a specter ghost guardian of the Soul Stone on Vormir, but he's not played by Hugo Weaving. That's actually Ross Marquand doing a Hugo Weaving impersonation in Infinity War. He probably did some mocap or something, but it's a very kind of ghost cloak kind of character thing. So yeah, we don't see Hugo Weaving again, but he is good in this movie. And Sebastian Stan is also introduced as Bucky Barnes. He falls to his death, seemingly, in this movie, but those who know the comics knew that that just meant he was going to come back as the Winter Soldier, and so he did. There you go. And for casting the supporting characters, Tommy Lee Jones, Toby Jones, and Stanley Tucci are also very enjoyable in this movie. Another positive for this movie is that Captain America had always been a well-known character in Marvel Comics, but not necessarily the most popular. When everything went down with Marvel Studios in its beginnings, it turned out that they still had the rights for movies for the characters that ended up making up the Avengers, which is how this whole thing got started. But Captain America was not really even an A-list character at the time. This movie could have been considered a risk based on that, but it did fairly well at the box office, and it was received quite well. Chris Evans is, again, incredible as Steve Rogers. I think the characterization works perfectly. I think his character is very well defined, and it's very clear who this guy is and what he stands for. The transformation scene where he grows huge also works really well. Yes, it's all super soldier nonsense. Yes, it's all silly, but it you kind of buy it, right? He sells it quite well, and that's also in the direction of Joe Johnston and how it all works. The musical theme for Captain America, while it could be stronger and more commonly used throughout the MCU, it is recognizable, it is pretty good, and they use it well in this movie. It just, I feel like it doesn't, they do use that recurring theme in other musical scores, but I feel like it could be more used in other movies. Steve Rogers' characterization does improve, I would say, in future movies, but I think this movie lays a great foundation for the First Avenger. The introduction of Hydra also works really well. Hydra in the comics was always this super secret organization, and so setting this movie in a World War II setting and having Hydra kind of be the underpinning of everything and laying seeds to be built upon and grown in future movies and stories is really well done here. And I think Hydra having a role in this movie and Red Skull being the leader of Hydra, but the whole philosophy is you cut off one head and two more shall take its place, starts here and is built upon later, which is great. Lastly, the Tesseract is introduced in Captain America: The First Avenger. Red Skull described it as the jewel of Odin's treasure room, referencing Odin, Thor's father, of course, from the realm of Asgard. He finds the Tesseract in a hidden compartment in a stone carving of in the wall of Yggdrasil, the tree of the world in Norse mythology. This is a connection to much later in the MCU. Much later in the TV series Loki on Disney+, and spoiler warning for that, Loki, the adopted son of Odin and the sort of half-adopted brother of Thor, ends up replacing Kang the Conqueror's variant called He Who Remains, and he ends up physically holding the strands of all timelines. He kind of embeds himself on a throne within all these strands of the timelines, and as the camera pulls back in that show, it resembles a giant tree, referencing Yggdrasil again, as connecting to Loki's Norse mythology roots. So that's more of a nod to that. But also in this movie, The First Avenger, we see Yggdrasil again. I think that's kind of cool. Of course, that's many years before and after. So not a connection when they made this movie, but just a connection later on in the MCU that I've seen. Little treats for you when you follow along with Movie Marathons HQ. Back to the Tesseract, it's cool to think that this was an Infinity Stone before we knew it was an Infinity Stone. It's specifically the Space Stone, and the Tesseract and Space Stone end up being crucial for Captain Marvel's origin story, which we'll watch in a few weeks. And then, of course, as an Infinity Stone, it's major in Infinity War and the entire Infinity Saga. There are some negatives in this movie for me. The pace. I think the pace of this movie is pretty slow, and I find myself bored every time I've watched this movie. In the middle, the beginning's pretty good and the ending's fine, but in the middle I just find it quite boring, so the pace doesn't really work. The CGI in the beginning of the movie works but doesn't work. I say that it works because I get it that they shot Chris Evans doing the scenes, and then they CGI his head, and then they shoot the scene again the same way with a skinny actor, and they put kind of those two things together. It does hold up still, even all these years later, but it just doesn't work. The floating head that you know is not attached to the right body, it never quite overcomes that as a viewer, so the uncanny valley is just weird. So that's a negative. It just doesn't really work, though I commend them for trying, and it's creative, and once he becomes Captain America and his head is on his proper body, the contrast works because you get it. He grew up and he got this super soldier serum, it's all good. But the CGI just doesn't, it's just weird. And for the last negative, I would say continuity. This doesn't work. By this time in the MCU, we had seen Iron Man 2, and in Iron Man 2, we see flashbacks of Tony Stark's father, Howard Stark. In Iron Man 2, he's portrayed by John Slattery. And then this movie came out, and Howard Stark again makes a supporting role and an appearance, but he's portrayed by a different actor named Dominic Cooper. Dominic Cooper doesn't do a bad job, but when I think of Howard Stark in my mind, I'm thinking of the John Slattery version. I get it that this one's based and set in the 1940s, but in Iron Man 2, the flashback is in the 80s or maybe 90s, so maybe it couldn't be the same actor. It just doesn't work for me for continuity that there's these two actors a few decades apart that look so different. I think Dominic Cooper acts like Howard Stark. He acts like how a young Tony Stark's father would act, but having two actors is jarring for me. Now, how might this movie connect to the theme of our movie marathon, Avengers Doomsday? We know that Sebastian Stan was announced as part of the cast of Avengers Doomsday, so Bucky Barnes will show up in that movie. Likely, it's just continuity of the Thunderbolts. In that movie, he's one of the leaders of the Thunderbolts / the New Avengers. So when Doomsday comes around, he's going to be leading one of the Avengers teams. They also reference that Captain America, Sam Wilson, has another team of Avengers. That's kind of interesting. That'll be part of Doomsday. But yeah, we'll definitely see Bucky Barnes leading the Avengers at the start of Doomsday at the very least. I doubt that Chris Evans is going to appear in Avengers Doomsday. At the end of Endgame, he returned all the Infinity Stones to their timeline, but then he did go back to some kind of an alternate timeline where he got to live his life with Peggy. Then he came back to our typical 616 timeline and returned the Captain America shield and gave it to Sam Wilson. Then we don't know what happened to him, whether he went back or just lived out his days in our universe, in our MCU. So that's kind of where we've left the character. He's not dead, but he's almost dead. I don't think we're going to see him in Avengers Doomsday. However, in the comics, there's a variant of Captain America who is a supporter and leader of Hydra. So in that timeline, he becomes the leader of Hydra and embodies those principles rather than the principles that we know him to embody here. So maybe there's a chance that they're writing a Captain Hydra little cameo thing that Chris Evans would want to do as Steve Rogers. If anything, though, I don't think that would be in Avengers Doomsday. I think that could be in Avengers Secret Wars, which comes out the following year, so December 2027. Maybe we see Chris Evans return as Steve Rogers as a Captain Hydra in that movie, but I don't think that would be in Avengers Doomsday. So that's my review of Captain America, the First Avenger. What do you think of this movie? And how do you think it's going to connect to Avengers Doomsday? Make sure to let me know in the comments. Follow Movie Marathons HQ on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and also on Letterboxd, where I have listed the 5 versions of the movie marathon. There's my personal list that you can click on and you can follow. And if you're watching on your own timeline, you can see how I have arranged all the movies. Or if you want to watch the chronological order of the MCU or expanded MCU, or the release order of the MCU and expanded MCU, all 5 of those lists are on Letterboxd, so you can follow Movie Marathons HQ there. See you at the movies!